Hello friends. For today's video, I wanted to have a little bit of a conversation about what I'm calling the never-ending consumerism debate. If you are somebody who has engaged with bookish content over a number of years, you've probably seen this topic pop up. It feels like every couple of years it resurfaces. There are some points to it that I think are incredibly fair, and then having seen this pop up a number of times, I actually think there are some points that rarely get addressed that I wanted to dive into a little bit today. Even though I am going to be approaching this from the angle of book-related consumerism conversations, obviously you can take this, extract it, and apply it to conversations about consumerism in other places. First thing though that I want to address is that even though this is a conversation that pops up in book communities every few years, I actually think the thing that was different this last time it popped up is that it became much more of just a trend to comment on consumerism at large. Entire channels were starting to be dedicated to this very concept, and usually how it played out is there would be some kind of thumbnail where a person would look shocked or taken aback, and in the backdrop of the thumbnail there would be some person with a large collection of fill-in-the-blank items. A lot of the point of this was to kind of look at this and sort of point a finger at the people who are actually purchasing a lot of items or who are in possession of a lot of items and kind of collectively say, let's not be like them. Because this became more of a trend, I also think some of the fair criticisms of consumerism were actually getting lost, because in the past I felt like some of the criticisms were very understandable and legitimate. So for example, I think it's fair to talk about the environmental impact of purchasing a lot of material items. I also think a lot of people were trying to zero in on the idea that your value as a person doesn't come down to how much you own, how many physical things that you possess, and also you shouldn't then judge other people for how much they own and how much they possess. There were examples of people, once again, returning specifically to book community things. There were people in the past who would have their own channels or who would start some kind of book-related social media, and because they didn't own a lot of books, they felt pressure to go and buy a bunch of books and to talk about the books in just their physical forms, not even the books' stories, but just the editions, and they felt like they had to get the bookshelves and all those sorts of things. And then sometimes they were starting to have financial struggles as a result of this, or sometimes they were filled with a lot of buyer's remorse. They didn't really want those things, they just felt like they had to. And then the conversation became very much about scrutinizing those individuals who were being open about their struggles, where some people were saying, this is your own fault, you're a grown adult, you shouldn't blame anybody else for your purchases, and then other people kind of blaming other people who do have a lot of whatever the thing may be, because of course this doesn't just have to be related to books, but if we're talking about booktubers in particular, there was then blame being put on booktubers for creating what they felt like was pressure, or viewers of booktube who they felt were creating pressure for other people to have to buy things in order to just participate in the conversation. An example of this, which is somewhat anecdotal, but I've actually seen this exact thing, where somebody once commented on one of my videos saying that if somebody doesn't have a backdrop of books for their videos, they won't watch their videos because, quote, how are they supposed to know, and I'm paraphrasing here, but how are they supposed to know what books they like and if they have parallels in their reading tastes if not for there being books behind them? Which is disappointing, and I don't agree whatsoever with that mindset. Also, I'll add, sometimes people keep books even if they didn't like them, if they were gifted to them, or maybe because for them it's still part of their home library, in the same way you walk into a library, and you shouldn't anyway go and be like, I don't like a lot of these books here, so this library sucks. You know, you don't do that. And so some people treat their home library like a library, where I read this, I didn't really care for it, but it's still an opportunity to have discussion about a work of art, and I like having it for a reference point. So sometimes the books that people keep behind them aren't even books that they loved necessarily, and then sometimes the books are unread. So that line of thinking, in my opinion, was quite shallow. I also think that when somebody is making an effort to review books or discuss books online, we should listen to what they're saying, and that should be more of the focus than what books are behind them. Yes, I do like having my books in the background of my book-themed videos. In my mind, I see it as similar to if somebody has their own cooking channel or show or something like that. It makes sense that they are, even if they're not always literally in the process of cooking, it makes sense that they would have cooking themed things. You recognize it makes sense for the background to be related to the topic. Also, if somebody is doing something with music, even if they're not literally playing in that exact moment, it makes sense they might be in a studio or they might be in their music room or something like that. I know it's not the same for literally everyone, but for me, I just think of it as this is related to what I do. However, if somebody is choosing to talk about books and they're just sitting on their couch or their bed or the floor, that's completely fine. The substance of what they're saying matters more to me than what their background is. Returning though to how I felt like this trend had shifted as it was really becoming popular over the last year or 2 years. As I was saying, there are people that are making entire channels where every single week it's the same thing. It's look at this person with a bunch of stuff, let's all point and laugh. And then it was under the guise of like, I'm just concerned for people's well-being. There is some level of cognitive dissonance between those two statements, because if you think somebody genuinely is suffering from something that makes them feel like they have to have items in order to have happiness, and the more items they have, the less they feel fulfilled, but yet they still feel compelled because they're still thinking, well, if I just get more. If you're actually concerned about somebody's well-being, I don't think that hyper monitoring them in an online space actually is where they're going to get help. Rarely does online intervention actually help people in most spaces. Doesn't mean that you can't have criticisms online or that you can't launch criticisms at certain people if you feel like their behavior is troublesome, but when they're under the guise of, oh, I just care deeply for these people and I feel sorry for them, well, maybe don't plaster them all over your thumbnail and all over your video for thousands and thousands of people to mock them, to be filling in the comment section all of these statements about what's wrong with these people are stupid. Because yeah, I don't think that that's gonna help if they are in your mind struggling with something emotionally or mentally or maybe even financially. I don't know if a pile on of people saying, yeah, what a freak, basically, I don't think that that's really helping the situation. I want to emphasize again that environmental impacts are a very legitimate reason to push back against consumerism. I also think consumerism can lead to people feeling deeply unwell because they don't have fill in the blank XYZ thing, especially if they don't have those things by a certain age or a certain point in their life. So I think all of that is very, very valid. But how I see how a lot of it plays out is rarely actually taking into account those things, and it's more so just elevating the person who is creating the video and also sometimes the people watching the videos. It's a way for them to come together and to feel better about themselves over someone else, and the person that they're making themselves feel better than is somebody who probably has more in common with you than the people who are possibly actually creating the biggest environmental negative impacts in the world, or the people that really play a role, or the corporations, I should say, who really play a role in going after individuals and having your data and then using your data to specifically target you and advertise certain things to you. That culture that's created, I recognize that all of us are active participants, and if you're going to talk about possessions online, then you are, I think, engaging in consumerism in some fashion, and I think it's fair to have conversations about that. I'm not saying they shouldn't be allowed, but I do think sometimes we elevate ourselves on a person-by-person basis instead of directing a lot of our frustrations towards those who are actually creating the most harm to the planet or to people's well-being. And I do want to zero in on the economic side of all of this. So most of the time, the directions that we're going back and forth in these conversations are between usually working class people. A lot of times people who are low, or they are low middle to upper middle class individuals. The people that their carbon footprint over the course of their whole life, if we are tying this back to environmental concerns, these individuals, their entire lives are not going to have the same level of impact as far as their carbon footprints do because they bought some Stanley Cups or some books. It's not going to have the same kind of a carbon footprint as a lot of other individuals. So for example, this is a very recent thing, but after the Super Bowl, there was this thing that showed the amount of extremely wealthy individuals who were leaving private jets directly after the Super Bowl. And I think for most people who are just kind of buying books, that's not the same. And again, I'm not saying that we can't care about both, or we can't care about the concept of consumerism as a whole, because if we look at it on small scale, the idea, I think, for a lot of people is, well, the more money you have, if you're continuously engaging in consumerism mindsets, the more that you've not restricted yourself, the more that you aren't filled with gratitude for what you have or contentment, and you would just be like those people who are flying their private jets all over the world with no care whatsoever to the impact on the planet or things like that. And maybe there is some truth to that, but when it feels like a lot of the conversation behind consumerism is dominated by working class people pointing and basically laughing at other working class people, it starts to feel less like you actually care about these broader topics and more so like you just want to feel a little bit better about yourself. Which, given that one of the criticisms about consumerism is the ways in which we try to self-soothe through material things, this isn't that different from it. It's just instead of buying a thing and then feeling some dopamine or feeling a little bit of happiness because of this thing that we wanted and then we now possess. And sure, there are criticisms to be had about that, but also I think it's okay for people to want to buy things on occasion. Regardless, if we're looking at, oh, I have concern for people that don't feel contentment and I just feel so bad for them, okay, but then when it feels as though you are starting to not have contentment in yourself and how you choose to live your life, and you have to then basically micromanage the ways in which other people spend their money, and people that don't have a lot of money, people that don't have the ability to have huge impacts on other people's lives and whatnot, it does start to feel like you are also engaging in a practice that is less about your own well-being and your own mental health, and also now it's directed at somebody else. And I do want to tie in, because I keep referencing the working class side of things, so I want to give an example of what I mean by this. Now, I don't make very much money. A lot of you know, I taught private violin lessons for a long time, but then in 2020, during COVID and when my father wasn't doing well, I pretty much had to completely stop my business, and I didn't really have an income, and I was taking care of my father. I got no financial compensation for that. I would do it again in a heartbeat so that I could be there for him in his final months, because it was very, very challenging, and I know that it was definitely for him more comfortable to have me present than if I hadn't been there. I don't even know what he would have done if I wasn't there, because he needed assistance. But it did mean that I kind of had to start over at a point in my life where I feel like a lot of people start to feel like, oh, okay, now I'm starting to feel settled. I kind of had to start over. And so I don't have a lot of financial safety nets. I don't have necessarily a lot of financial security. I don't have a lot of inherited wealth. My father grew up extremely poor. My grandparents on my mother's side are immigrants from another country. So there are a lot of reasons why financially I really feel for people who don't necessarily have a lot, but also being around somebody like my father who grew up in poverty, I heard a lot growing up about being grateful for what you have and finding contentment in your work or finding joy in the little things, in experiences, all of those things. Simultaneously, though, if my dad was out, he was a very, He was somebody who did a lot of work around his house, and he built things, and if he went to a garage sale and he found a good deal on tools, he already had some tools, but if he found a good deal on some more tools, he was going to get those tools. And if somebody made a video about my dad's tools and were like, look at this guy engaging in consumerism, I'd be like, my dad grew up living in like hay barns and abandoned train cars and experienced homelessness as a child, and it kind of feels weird that you're directing this animosity toward him or towards just other working class people because he has maybe a few too many wrenches now, because wrenches are in a lot of tool sets, but he didn't have this other thing that came in that set. It was a good deal or whatever. If you're like, he has so many different tools, does he need all those tools? You know, if you're doing that and you're like, okay, but what about all of the reasons, all of the things that led to the level of poverty he had, which my father was part Native American, Choctaw specifically. And so part of what led to his family being in poverty was the displacement of Native Americans in our country. If you like trace back in his family, that was part of it. And so it's like, wait, we need to look at bigger, broader pictures that lead to these sorts of things. And I know when you were thinking, oh, a conversation about consumerism, maybe you weren't thinking we were going to start talking about all of these bigger things. And again, I recognize that people are capable of caring about multiple things. You can care about the big structural things, and then we can have conversations about us as individuals and how we partake in some of these bigger things. We're not people who are absolved simply because maybe we don't make as much money. But I think it's the balancing of it. I do feel like maybe collectively we are very reactionary. I think collectively sometimes on the internet we have an easier time pointing a finger at somebody who is actually much closer to us, even if they have less impact on these broader topics. We feel more comfortable because usually there's some kind of direct response. You get that person's reaction, or maybe that person even comments on the video, or somebody else who's a fan of that person comments on the video, or something or other, where you feel like you kind of feel like you made a difference. But really, it's almost like we're too afraid to go up against these bigger things, whether they be corporations or whether they be some kind of group or person or entity that has an enormous amount of wealth and is actually contributing to the things that we take a lot of issue with. And I think a lot of us can agree on about the environmentalism side of things and other such parts of the consumerism conversation. A lot of times we don't want to go up against those things because within our lifetime, we're never actually going to see results of that. But you kind of have to start thinking outside of just that immediate dopamine hit of feeling like you made a difference because you went after somebody who is also, in some ways, a victim of our societal structures, which include consumerism. I was talking about some personal things that are associated with this. I want to mention a book that has a little bit more of this tied within it, and not necessarily probably in a way that initially seems connected, but I think actually really is a great example of what I'm trying to convey. So the book Evicted, it's nonfiction by Matthew Desmond. It's fantastic, it's brutal, and it's told very, very well, and it showcases just how devastating the eviction process can be for a lot of people, pretty much for anybody that faces it. But not only is it devastating because of the initial concept of being evicted from your home, but trying to get out of that environment, how it disproportionately affects certain groups over others, and how there is money to be made through the eviction process for landlords and other people. One of the individuals who suffers from this circumstance, they get some assistance. It is very, very, very meager. It's a tiny amount. And the way that Matthew Desmond wrote the book is that he would accompany people pretty much in their day-to-day lives. He would record the conversations. He changed their name for privacy's sake. And then he also kind of removed himself from the narrative and then told it to you like a documentary. So it feels like you're watching it. And there's a part where this individual who is given very, very meager assistance, I believe it's every single month when they get their assistance, they pretty much always go out and buy themselves a nice dinner. And they ask them, why are you choosing to do this instead of using this assistance to basically try to get yourself out of this? And then they explain, if I were to save all of the money that I get from this for the whole year, it still wouldn't be enough to fill in the blank, put some kind of down payment on something, or try to even get in an apartment complex. Basically, it's nothing. It's scraps. It's breadcrumbs. It doesn't really help me. It would take most of my life. And at that point, there might be other hardships, and then I might have to use that money for something else anyway. So the way that they looked at it is, I would rather just enjoy this small moment, this one good meal. Basically, let me have this one good meal instead of trying to police the small amounts of joy that I do find in my very, very difficult life. I can't emphasize enough how much hardship the people that he is following in this, how much hardship they're facing. And by no means am I implying that situation is the same as buying 20 different Stanley Cups or something. I don't want it to come across like that. But I do think that highlights the way that we hyper focus on how some individuals who are, that person is not the reason for a lot of the problems in society. That person is just trying to get by. And I do think that we have kind of an obsession with monitoring this group in this area, and a lot of ourselves included. Again, I know there's a huge difference between those of us who are comfortably, we have shelter and food, versus people who every single day it's up for debate whether they're going to have those things. So I'm not trying to say that those are exactly the same, but the point I was trying to make at the beginning is that we have more in common with those people. So many people are just a few paychecks away, if not one paycheck away, from facing a similar situation. And we do, I think, have a lot of pointing fingers at each other, despite the fact that we have more in common, and we are also sometimes more so likely to be victims of the same sorts of things. And instead of directing our animosity at each other or this sort of moral superiority over each other, I think if we all kind of collectively looked at the bigger picture sorts of things and then directed our energy in that direction, maybe we would have a little bit more of an impact. This is not to say that a lot of us can't do more to really think through and process the good points that are being made when there are criticisms towards consumerism. I think it's healthy for people to ask themselves, do I need this? Could this go toward a better cause? If you have the money to afford a lot of material things, and you always choose that over donating to a shelter, a charity, or helping out a friend in need, or whatever the case may be, if you're pretty much always prioritizing having material things over taking some of that and trying to give back, then yeah, you probably should do some reflection. And also, if you are consistently complaining about your situation, but you have the means to do more, and you just are bad at managing your money, I mean, that's something a lot of people could probably reflect on as well. So I don't want to try and imply that nobody has any agency in their own life, because that's not true. Plenty of people have plenty of agency. But aside of this, that I have seen that I get a little bit frustrated with, is that there are people, when I talk about people that are like elevating themselves because, oh, I don't bother, if we're going back to the book example, I just only use the library and I don't ever buy any books because I care more about experiences. And they have that mindset. And you're like, if you actually push on that and you say, describe an experience for me, what's an example? And if they say, oh, I really love to travel, and you push them on that a little bit more, like, okay, well, tell me where you might want to travel. Rarely is it like, oh, I went to this local area and I went camping and the whole thing was free except for the gas that it took in my car. Unless, of course, they like somehow biked there or took public transportation. But usually it's not that. Usually it's, I love to travel and live in all these expensive cities. I like to move around a lot. And you're like, one vacation for the price of airline tickets, trying to stay somewhere, even if you're trying to find somewhere very inexpensive to stay, also food and snacks for your trip, or just water, depending on where you are, because sometimes water's not free, but just the cost to have this one experience, because experiences are just so much better than owning books I could get at the library, which doesn't even account for the fact that not everybody has access to a library, not everybody lives in an area where they're close to a library, and some people's library systems suck. But that aside, if you're elevating yourself because you care about experiences, but your experiences, one of them costs more than the amount that a person might spend an entire year on books, you're actually just revealing that you are rich. You have the means to travel a bunch of times over the course of a year, and somebody else maybe doesn't. So maybe they get books at library sales, or maybe they buy books when they are on sale, or they get discounts or whatever. The amount of hours of their not only enjoyment that you get from books, but of course most of us recognize there are really positive sides to reading. So the hours that you get out of books versus one trip for a few days, and if you're self-employed like I am, where if you do take time off, that's not exactly covered. You don't get money. Most people that aren't self-employed understand that if you take time off, you have vacation days. But if you're self-employed, you don't. So it's almost like you literally are losing money just by taking time off. Then you're spending money, so it feels like it's twice as big of a thing. At that point, you maybe have less of an awareness of what it's actually like to have less than other people. You think that you're really minimal, and you think that you're anti-consumerist, as though going on a trip isn't partaking in some form of consumerism also, or like there isn't some kind of showmanship involved with being well-traveled. And I'm not trying to throw digs at traveling. Traveling's wonderful, and it's great to see other people in other places and other cultures and other environments. All of that's wonderful. I just wanted to point out that sometimes when people make certain criticisms, they aren't really always recognizing that sometimes, if, again, talking about books, sometimes these are, for some individuals, the most that they're able to get out of out of experiences, if you want to word it that way. So, you know, not everybody has the money to go to concerts. Not everybody has the money to enjoy going to different restaurants or sports games or things like that. Sometimes the most they can afford is to grab a book from their local indie bookstore that they got for like $3 because it's a trade paperback and it costs nothing. And for them, that's like a whole week's worth of an experience. Sometimes we just really need to interrogate the actual point of some of these, because there are a lot of exceptionally valid points to criticizing consumerism. It just doesn't feel like those points are actually the thing that get expanded upon and zeroed in on. The thing I want to do is to highlight how I think that this gets kind of viewed through in book spaces, book hauls. I did, when I first saw the consumerism conversation occurring years and years ago, I really thought back through a lot of what people were saying. A lot of what people were saying I think were very, very legitimate, and I think there were a lot of concerns about the ways in which we are creating a certain culture of constantly feeling the need to buy things instead of enjoying what you have, among the other criticisms that I have mentioned. So I had thought about it, and the conclusion I came to, and why I still on occasion do book hauls, there's a number of things. And I actually think of all the other things to get brought into the equation here. This is going to seem like completely out of left field, but some of it is resisting AI in creative spaces. So I'm going to elaborate on this. I am hugely against AI in creative spaces. Of course, there are instances where it can be used in the medical field, and that's amazing because it leads to helping save people's lives. That's fantastic. Also, I recognize that some people work corporate settings, their bosses or their entire company is forcing people to use certain AI functions, and maybe they hate it, but they kind of have to. And I, by no means, am asking you to quit your job and like stick it to your company, because I'm not asking people to completely derail their whole life and be financially unstable just to say, like, I refuse to use ChatGPT at work, which I know that's not necessarily exactly how it plays out for people, but I think you understand the process. But in creative spaces, oftentimes using AI is actually contributing to removing people's professions, and professions that for a lot of us have provided enrichment and bridges our differences by helping us understand each other through art, through film and television and books. And when you have AI in these spaces, it really is just people, and talk about environmental impact, there is a huge environmental impact about all of this. So how this relates to books. Within a lot of book spaces, there have been, over the last 5 to 7, 8 years or so, a huge uptick in special editions. And I think there are criticisms even about this that we could get into, about how it's starting to feel like we care more about the flash as opposed to the substance, and it's just shallow, and everything is about, okay, actually let's judge a book by its cover. Well, I think that can be true. There's certainly a lot to do with that, and I feel like if the flash comes at the expense of great editing, I'm not for that. However, sometimes if we're talking about special edition book companies, or even some of the extra work that publishers are putting into the physical copies of books, these are job opportunities for those creatives that AI is pushing out. So, for example, special edition companies, oftentimes what will happen is that there will be some kind of extra illustration or multiple illustrations. Sometimes you have a dust jacket illustration, an illustration on the naked hardback, sometimes on the pages, and then when you open the book, the end paper illustrations, and then sometimes even interior illustrations over the course of the story. And you can hire one artist to do multiple pieces, you can hire one artist to do the whole project, or you can hire a number of different artists to do a number of the different illustrations. And those are all opportunities that some people are outsourcing to AI. So when you are supporting these special edition companies, which are like small businesses, when you're supporting these businesses, you're not just supporting consumerism, you're also supporting ensuring that creatives continue to have jobs, because I am a huge advocate for artists. I do not think that they are appreciated enough, and I'm really, really happy that there are book box companies, and on occasion publishers too, because publishers have to approve the actual making of these copies. But there are things in the industry that, even though I can be very critical of publishing in the industry at large, there are some places where good things are happening, and this is one of them. If somebody is doing a video where they're featuring special editions, or if somebody is doing a book haul and they're showing these, and they're showing the interior illustrations, and they're showing all the work that went into the creation of this book, if that is met with solely this idea of this is contributing to consumerism, you should feel bad, you should stop making these kinds of videos. While I think that there is nuance to this, and I think that sometimes there can be legitimacy to their frustrations, or that all of our frustrations sometimes with how certain things are shown, I also think there is another side of the coin, which is that if we aren't consistently appreciating the artistry that goes into some of this, then we're going to lose it. And those artists are going to lose these opportunities. And I don't want that to happen. Now, I referenced some of these companies almost like as small businesses. I also want to highlight that I know for myself, and this is true for other people as well, when they do, I'll use the example of book hauls again. When they do book hauls, oftentimes they do shop at local bookstores, which I think is wonderful. If you're doing book hauls and you're only ever really talking about brand new, super expensive books that you got at, or books that you bought off of Amazon or something, I mean, I could see a little bit more, frustration at that, because Amazon has a whole host of reasons why they aren't necessarily always helpful to authors and other creatives. But regardless, if somebody is making an effort to shop at their local bookstore, you're supporting a local business. A lot of times these local businesses, they end up hosting really wonderful community events. They're really strong advocates for a lot of really good causes, and you're kind of helping their business. So for myself, I frequently in doing book hauls talk about bookmans and changing hands. I also do go to the library. I try to do check-ins every now and then where I talk about all the money I saved by getting things at the library. Libraries also have really wonderful opportunities and programs. Libraries are fantastic. I can't say enough good things about libraries, because they really are significant pillars of our communities and we don't want to lose them. So I think there's a lot of positives to when you're talking about, if you're talking about books and you're talking about buying books, I recognize that it can come across, and sometimes for some people that what they are doing is they're just showing off, and I recognize that there are issues with that. But sometimes I think when we talk about creating a certain kind of culture, and are we creating a culture where we only value people through what they possess, or sometimes we're talking about where people put their money. If you're putting your money into your community, into local businesses, into supporting artists, and into sometimes trying to help your local libraries, I don't necessarily think it's bad to think that maybe that has more pros than cons to it. One thing that's exceptionally obvious that I haven't even touched on just yet, I was talking about helping small businesses, helping artists who are doing these beautiful illustrations, if we are talking about special editions. But if we're not talking about any of that and we're just talking about books themselves, on occasion, actually just purchasing a book obviously goes towards helping authors maintain their careers. And not every author has a safety net in their career. Not every author is a Sarah J. Maas or a Brandon Sanderson. Some of them, they still have their day jobs. Some of them have to have Patreon. Sometimes they have to do so much extra just to be able to continue writing. And if there's some ease that can be placed on that situation by supporting their work and thus purchasing their work, I don't know that that's necessarily something that I think is inherently a bad thing. I think ultimately that's something I am happy to support. I want to support authors. And yes, I do have books by Brandon Sanderson. That's one of the authors I just mentioned. Yes, there are some authors where they are very successful and I own some of their books. I try also to support a lot of indie authors, a lot of lesser known authors, and then tying this all back to book hauls of all things. But tying this all back to book hauls, within a book haul, that is sometimes an opportunity for me to mention authors who maybe people wouldn't have otherwise heard about. I have been a little surprised at the direction I feel like the consumerism conversation has taken and gone in, because in the past I felt like it was, and it could just be what I'm seeing, so I don't want to imply that nobody's brought up any good points, but in the past I felt like there were really good conversations that came out of this, and recently it just feels like it's a way to react. And I gotta add one more thing. Sometimes some of these entire channels that are dedicated to this, sometimes they're selling stuff. And I think it's so funny. Like sometimes they accept sponsorship. I'm not saying it's bad to accept a sponsorship necessarily, but sometimes they'll have like a sponsorship for something, and sometimes they're selling their own kind of products, and a little bit I'm just like, what? How do you not see that maybe there's some hypocrisy happening here? But anywho, that was just kind of a slight aside. Point is, I just feel like this conversation, there's a lot more to it than maybe sometimes we really dive into. And I figured it would be, because I feel like so many of you oftentimes have really wonderful input and you expand on topics really well. I just thought I would bring this to the table to all of you and see maybe how you feel about some of these things. And if you have more to add, if there are certain things that I didn't even talk about or mention, you are of course welcome to add that in the comments. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.